So as you know, on the third Sunday of each month, I do a kind of a recap of the homilies of the previous 2 Sundays and of the readings. So the theme for the 2 Sundays, which I'll go over in the beginning of today, has to do with parallel lifetimes or many trips to planet Earth. So I picked out 2 tiny little segments, one from John's Gospel, chapter 14, and one from Luke's Gospel, chapter 18, where it seems to me that Jesus, in different metaphors, is hinting at our many lifetimes and our many incarnations on planet Earth and the different families of which we come apart. So firstly, from John. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, so that where I am, you may be also. And from Luke, Peter said to Jesus, we have left all we had to follow you. Truly, I tell you, Jesus said to them, no one who has left home, our wife, our husband, our brothers, our sisters, our parents, our children, for the sake of the kingdom of God, will fail to receive many times as much in this present age and in the age to come, eternal life. Words inspired by God. So today what I want to do then, obviously, I want to do a quick recap of the homilies I gave on October the 4th and October the 11th. A very, very quick synopsis of both of them, and then open it up to Q&A. So on October the 4th, I gave a homily which I titled Past Lives or Parallel Lives. And it was in response to a brilliant letter that I'd received from a man called Troy Campbell, who lives in Idaho. And in fact, he attended the Mass subsequently. And he asked a lot of questions, but I want to focus on 2 of the questions he asked that day were, why don't we remember past lives? If we have indeed lived in the past, why don't we remember that? And secondly, the notion of time, because I talked about parallel lives, living simultaneously in different spacesuits at the same time. So those are the 2 basic questions. So I'm going to very, very quickly recap what I said about them. So firstly, to the question, if we've lived in the past, in past lifetimes, if we've had, incarnations going way back, how come we don't remember them? How come, as Troy Campbell, living in Idaho, he didn't remember that he lived in Greece in 1050 AD? Or why, as Seán ÓLaoire, do I not remember, being a Celt in Ireland, in 500 BCE? So my answer to that is this. I gave the example of an actor, like for instance, Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks has played roles in possibly hundreds of movies. And 2 of those movies were Forrest Gump and Mr. Rogers. He gave sterling performances in both. Now, as Forrest Gump in the movie Forrest Gump, as Forrest Gump, has no recollection and no knowledge whatsoever of Mr. Rogers. And in the movie Mr. Rogers as Mr. Rogers knows nothing about Forrest Gump. But Tom Hanks knows precisely that these were 2 roles he played, and many, many, many other roles. So as we play our roles in different incarnations, we're totally confined to the role. It's very difficult for us to know about other roles we're subsequently playing or playing in parallel. And I gave the example of almost nobody can remember an incident from the first 2 years of this lifetime. When you were a little infant at 3 months or 9 months or 15 months, almost nobody can recollect a memory from the first 2 years of this life. But those 2 years are the most formative years of your life. Your personality is being fashioned in those 2 years. So who you will be becoming is fashioned by stuff you don't have conscious recall of. And I mentioned that in the Hindu model, where there are 7 different levels of body, that after we drop off this physical body, we then have to drop off the etheric energy body, and then we take occupancy of the astral body, and we download all of the experiences of the incarnation just ended into the archive of the astral body. And as we continue moving back towards God, through the mental body and the causal body and the soul back to the cosmos itself. At level 5, we find the archive of all of the experiences of all of the lifetimes we've ever lived on this planet or elsewhere. And when we reincarnate, all of that information is hardwired into the newborn, even if we don't have conscious recall over it. I talked about the importance of needing many, many incarnations. And I used the example of a chess game. In any chess game, there are 10 to the power of 123 possible moves you could make. That's 10 multiply, that's 10 with 123 zeros after it. That's trillions and trillions and trillions of possible moves you can make in a chess game. But in the average chess game, you're only going to make 80 moves. So how can you possibly understand chess if you only have one game in which you made 80 moves? And so incarnations are like that. In any incarnation, you can only make a few moves because you're locked into a particular gender, into a particular ethnic group, into a particular religion, into a particular socioeconomic status. And so you can't experience life just from a single chess game. That's why we need many, many incarnations in order to savor what it means to be a human being. And during that period, I reminded us that there are two aspects to the soul. There's what's called Atman, which never leaves the sight of God, and there's Jiva, which dips into incarnation. It's like what happens to you when you're asleep at night. Most of the intelligence of your body is gone. It's in the dream state. Only enough remains in the body, to keep your metabolism moving so you can breathe, and make your heart beat. But most of the intelligence is gone elsewhere. And the same thing is true with incarnation. Most of the intelligence of the soul is not incarnated, but there's a connection happening constantly between the two of them, between Atman and Jiva. And it comes in dreams, intuitions, visions, accidental encounters with teachers or teachings, meditation, time spent in nature, interacting with little babies. All of these are ways in which Atman and Jiva constantly communicate with each other. And in that homily as well, I talked about the notion that time is totally made up. And it's because of the fact that our brains during incarnation are so small that they can't grok the entire gestalt. And so we have to break up our experiences into bite-sized pieces and process them sequentially. So time and dates are just names and categories that we invent in order to measure the changes and the transformations of the evolution of our consciousness. And I gave this example about, a famous incident that happened on the 31st of December, 1899, when a ship sailing from Vancouver, Canada, down to Australia, it was called the Warimu, and they realized that they were almost at the intersection point between the equator, which is a horizontal line of latitude, and a line of longitude, 180 degrees east or west, which is the international date line. And by altering their trajectory and their speed, they were crossing that intersection point on the stroke of midnight. So one part of the ship was in a different century. It was in a different month. It was in a different week. It was in a different day. It was in a different hemisphere. It was in a different season from the other part. Since then, I've been thinking, what if you found a tiny little island right at that spot? And only 1 mile long, perhaps, by half a mile wide. But you live on that island and you know exactly where the demarcation point is between the north and the south and between the international date line. And you decide just to run backwards and forwards for the fun of it. So you're actually going backwards and forwards between centuries, between seasons, and between hemispheres. And you're doing it in the twinkling of an eye. And so time is totally, totally made up. I talked about the fact that, when you take a book, even a 400-page book, everything you're going to read in that book is already contained within the covers. Every single idea, every paragraph, every chapter, it's already there. But it's going to take you maybe 25 hours to read it and process it. So, but it's all there. It's only because of the speed of your reading that you're going to take 25 hours to read it. If you were to download that book from Amazon, you could download it in 20 seconds, all of the same material. I mentioned that the famous American psychologist Abraham Maslow once said that if all you have is a hammer, everything begins to look like a nail. And I want to kind of paraphrase that and say that when all you have is a template called time, everything then begins to look like past, present, or future. But only the now is real. A very famous Greek scientist, philosopher called Heraclitus, who lived about 500 BCE, said famously, "No man steps into the same river twice, for it is not the same river, and he's not the same man." So we can't be defined by the physicality of our spacesuits. We are waves of divinity dancing on a cosmic ocean of unconditional love. And I used a final metaphor that Sunday to illustrate what I understand. I said, imagine you take a beautiful colored photograph of Mount Everest, and then you produce hundreds and hundreds of copies of this beautiful photograph, and you paste them onto a long sheet of paper, glossy paper, and you glue that down to a long sheet of thin cardboard. And then you get a device, I call it a cardboard puncher, where you punch out the individual copies of this, separate them from each other, and internally there's a divider that breaks it up into 5,000 pieces, each copy broken into 5,000 pieces along these squiggly lines. And then for each copy, you jumble up the pieces and put them in a box with a picture of the Mount Everest on the cover. And then you seal the box and you send it off to be sold. And now you receive that box and you open it up and you tumble out all the pieces onto the table, 5,000 pieces. And the first thing you have to realize is that a lot of the pieces are upside down. You're just looking at cardboard. There's no way you can, create the jigsaw puzzle unless you realize some of them are upside down. You got to turn them right side up. It means that you have to encounter every event for what it's really saying, not what it appears to be saying, but what it's really saying. And then you begin putting the pieces together. And so in some senses then, in this analogy, Mount Everest represents God. And the individual copies represent individual souls, fractals of source. And time is the cardboard puncher that divides it up into segments. And so each piece then is a particular incarnation. And you have to realize that when you open the box, that every piece that's there is necessary, and every piece that's necessary is there. You don't need any extra pieces, and there are no pieces which you're not going to use. And if you reach the end of your life with big gaps in the jigsaw puzzle because you haven't figured out where to put the pieces, you're going to have to come back and figure it out again. So that was the homily I gave on October the 4th. Last Sunday, I gave a homily and I entitled it Pareidolia, selecting the reality of love. And I gave you the definition of pareidolia, the Greek word. And pareidolia means inferring non-existing patterns from random data. So you look at a bunch of data and you infer a pattern which allegedly doesn't really exist. It's an illusion. Like you're out walking and you see a cloud, you say, oh, that looks exactly like an elephant. And so you're imposing a non-existing image on random data in the sky. Or you're walking in the forest and you see this wriggly thing on the ground and you jump, you think it's a snake. And you look down and it's a piece of rope or it's a vine. So that's what pareidolia means. It means inferring non-existing images from totally random data. But I told you I have a totally different hit on pareidolia. And I began thinking about this years ago when I attended a lecture given by a brilliant American scientist called Bernard Heisch, where he talked about creation by subtraction. So the example would be this. If I take a slide projector and I shine white light through it onto a white screen, brilliant white light. White light contains all of the colors of the spectrum, which is why if you pass white light through a prism, you're going to get the rainbow, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, and all the shades of all those in between. But the white light contains all of those. So initially, all you're seeing is white light. Now, if you take a blue slide and you slot it into the projector, all of a sudden, all you see is blue on the screen. So you think, oh, I put a blue slide in, and so I've added blue to the palette of colors. You didn't. When you put a blue slide in, you did not add blue to the screen. What you did is you took away all of the other colors except blue. So you added nothing. You did not add blue light to the screen. You took away all of the colors except blue. And the same thing if you put pink or green or whatever color you put in, you're not adding that color to the image on the screen. You're subtracting all of the other colors so that only this one remains. And I said that this, in my opinion, that's the essence of what appears to be pareidolia. It's not that you're inferring false images from random data. It's that you're stripping away the data that don't match what your intention is. And I gave the example of Michelangelo taking a block of Carrara marble and chiseling out, the Pieta. So the Pieta was locked in there. All he did, he took away the pieces that were in the Pieta. Now with the same block of marble, he could have picked any image he wanted, and he could have picked that image out by taking the stuff that didn't create that image. There's a beautiful passage it's the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, where Thomas says, if you bring forth that which is within you, what you bring forth will give you life. If you fail to bring forth that which is within you, what you fail to bring forth will kill you. So if we fail to bring forth the images hidden within the data, in other words, God's face or God's demeanor, if we fail to bring that forth in our relationships, whether they're relationships at an interpersonal level, at a communal level, or an international level, if we fail to bring forth the face of God in all our relationships, what we fail to bring forth will kill us. And to go back to what Sister Joan Chichester just said about our country and our world, if we fail to bring forth the face of God from our times, what we fail to bring forth will kill us as a nation or as a globe. So that's what I mean by pareidolia being misunderstood. I talked about this childhood game you played, obviously, where you got a sheet with just a whole bunch of dots in it. And you were told there's a giraffe hidden in these dots. Can you join the particular dots so you get the giraffe out of it? So you got to highlight some of the dots and ignore some of the other dots. And that's what incarnation is about. Incarnation is about learning to join the appropriate dots so that the face of God emerges in every incarnation, that you see it in an oak tree or a banana slug or a politician, or a world situation. God is hidden there if you know how to infer God and if you know how to respond with love and compassion and forgiveness. And I ended up by talking about people who encounter Jesus. Of all of the people who encounter Jesus, this is an extraordinary avatar who's saying the same thing and doing the same things, but people's reactions, people unpacking of who he was were radically different. His mother, pushed him into his public ministry by saying they have no wine. So that was her image of her son. His brothers and sisters thought he was crazy. I read last week from Mark's Gospel in chapter 3, verses 21 and verses 31, where when Jesus began his public ministry, his brothers and sisters literally thought he had a schizophrenic break. And they came to take him by force because they thought he had gone mad. And when they couldn't catch him, they persuaded his mother to come to see if she could talk some sense into him. So that's the same Jesus that they're encountering. His aunt, the mother of James and John, wanted him, to appoint her sons in prime positions in his new kind of government, one on the right and one on the left. That was her understanding of Jesus. The Pharisees thought he was a blasphemer for saying, before Abraham came to be, I am, or calling God Father. The Romans thought he was a rabble-rouser. Herod thought he was an entertainer, and the crowd just wanted a distraction from daily living. And so everybody meeting Jesus saw a different version of Jesus, because we see things not as they are, but as we are. So we're inferring from the data what's in our own hearts and in our own minds, because reality is in the mind and the heart of the observer. So we actually select through our attention and our intention. That to which we give attention flourishes, and that to which we deny attention shrivels up. So our attention and our intention creates it. And so Bernard Hayes had said famously, by limiting infinite possibility, you create finite reality. By subtracting a whole bunch of stuff, you create manageable reality. And my contention is that we now need to reverse that process. In our times, what we need to do is, by unlimiting finite reality, we can reconnect with infinite possibility. That is our job as human beings. It's to connect at a soul level with the infinity of the love of God. So that would have been last Sunday. So we'll open it up now to a Q&A.
Johanna?
I wanted to look at this from a different way for a second, to just ask you about past life bleed through. Like, if you're going along and something, since the time is all now, that you're actually finding that a part of you is paying attention to or feeling something from past life. It's not in this world. And then that sometimes when we come into this life, we will pull something from a past life to that we think we need, and sometimes in this lifetime in this body, it's not quite as appropriate or functional. I don't know if that's something you can address at all.
Sure, absolutely. So for one thing, all of the experiences of our past lives are hardwired into the newborn as we come in. So all of the learning that you've had in the past is part of your personality from the word go. Now, often we don't have conscious recall over any of that stuff. Sometimes, however, there's spontaneous recall. And certainly there are practices like, regression therapy, which can put you in contact with these things. But just like in a lifetime, of the billions of experiences you've had in this lifetime, the ones you choose to bring into consciousness will determine your peace of mind or your disturbed nature. If I continue harking back to people, who screwed me over in this lifetime, and I live my life wondering, and trying to think about why did they do that to me, then I'm setting myself up for anxiety and depression. So I have to be really careful which memories I choose to give attention to, which is why I said it's about attention and intention. So even within the confines of this incarnation, if I choose to focus on stuff, memories that I drag into the present moment, and I focus on those, I'm determining the level of serenity or anxiety I'm going to experience. Now, the question is, can we learn from past lifetimes? Is it appropriate sometimes to take into consciousness lessons that we may have learned in the past and have consciously forgotten? It is, but it needs to be done really, really carefully. I have to make sure that I'm in a safe environment, hopefully with a safe, friend who can accompany me on the journey. So I'm not going to just re-traumatize myself if it was a difficult thing, or inflate myself if it was a beautiful thing. So I have to choose, insofar as I can, to choose very carefully when and with whom I would choose to try to re-engage with the past life.
Okay. I will ask the next question, which kind of builds on what Joanne asked. What are the mechanisms that we should use for choosing? When you use the sort of color in the dots metaphor, you can end up with almost anything coming out of the pattern, and therefore one has to choose a path.
Yes.
And can you relate some of the things that you've said about choosing paths and how you determine the right choice against this, the metaphors that you've been using?
Okay, great question, Lawrence. So we live in a world of cacophonous viewpoints and perspectives, and that's true at every level, whether we're talking about politics, or global warming, or we're talking about religions or whatever. If you read the literature, the religious literature, you're trying to figure out, should I be a Christian because I've been told, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, outside the Catholic Church there's no redemption. Or if I'm a fundamentalist Christian, if I don't have a personal, relationship with Jesus, I'm going to go to hell for all eternity. Or if I'm, Jewish, that Orthodox Jewish, and I think that, I'm one of the chosen people, nobody else, is beloved of God. Or I'm a Muslim, and I think that unless I embrace the Muslim faith, I can't get to heaven. So all of these are different viewpoints, and I can't adopt all of them. I have to choose one, which puts me in mortal danger, because if this one isn't correct, then because I haven't chosen the correct one, I'm screwed in the afterlife. So in this cacophony, there has to be some kind of orienting principles that say, here's an indication of which ones are good or not. And Jesus said it very famously, by their fruits, you shall know them. It's not their dogmatic claims. It's not about crusades. It is not about numbers. It is about the fruits of what they're teaching. And when you see, for instance, that a system is creating, regularly people of love and compassion and forgiveness and patience, when you see that that's the effect of it, that's a system worth attending to. If you see a system which is xenophobic and is differentiating among and sending some people to hell, and calling other people infidels or barbarians or whatever, if you see such a system, again, whether it's religious or political or whatever, stay far away from that system. Any system which is producing evil fruit is an evil system. And any system which is really, really true is going to create love and harmony intrapsychically, interpersonally, intercommunally, and globally. And so there are orienting mechanisms that allow us to choose in these times of cacophony.
Laura?
My question is about the nature of time.
Okay.
It's something that, this idea that you shared years ago that I think about on and off, I've been wanting to ask, so I think it fits in today, about how the future, the present is the eschatology of the future. I forget that verb, that how the future sends waves back into the present. And that's why I'm asking my question, because I don't quite grasp this concept, but it's interesting to me and it keeps coming up lately. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Sure.
Thanks.
And so when we did the prayer study, which your mom and dad were a huge part way back in 1992, 93, one of the things I discovered in that prayer study is that we had a control group, and experimental groups. And in actual fact, although prayer had a huge effect, there was no discernible difference between the people in the control group and the people in the experimental group. Now, I had designed it in such a way that I said, if you wind up in the control group and you're not prayed for during the course of the study, I guarantee you on the anniversary of the study, we'll replicate it completely. And if you had been in the control group, we'll have people praying for you for 3 months, exactly as we did for the people in the experimental group. Now, I'm convinced that had a retroactive effect. That prayer is not time bound. And the fact that one group of people were receiving prayer in 1993, and the other people weren't getting the prayer until 1994. And I was analyzing the study in 1993 when the control group had not yet been prayed for. But prayer itself is trans-temporal. And so the effects of the prayer to come were already applied, because in one sense, there is no past, present, or future. So in the very, very fact that prayer was going to be offered ever, it's been applied immediately, which is why I think it's very important, to pray for people who have died, pray for our ancestors or whatever. And the image I use, I think I may have said it to you, when I trek in the creek down here, there's a creek that runs through my property called Pina Creek. And depending on the time of the year, sometimes the water is chest high, sometimes it's 15 feet high, and sometimes it's just knee high, depending on the time of the year. But as I trek the stream, sometimes if I'm walking downstream, sometimes I'll see ripples moving back upstream towards me. And I wonder, how can there be waves coming upstream against the flow of the river? And then I go around the corner and I encounter a big rock in the middle of the creek. And what's happening is the water is hitting the rock, is creating a reaction, and the reaction is rebounding and it's going back upstream. And I'm meeting the effects before I meet the cause. So this is what was really important, that sometimes, and science is beginning to recognize this in many, many ways. We think that the effect always comes after the cause. It ain't necessarily so. Sometimes the effect comes before the cause. And that was just a kind of a graphic illustration. I'm meeting the effects of the rock before I encounter the rock. And the same thing is true of life, that there is only the eternal now. Where there isn't the past, there isn't the future. In fact, in spite of the fact that we tried to create these timelines. So we've created, there's like a historical past, we think, stuff that really, really happened. And then there's the fictitious past, which is what the victors wrote about it. So there's 2 versions of the past. There's 2 versions of the present. There's what's really happening in our world right now. And then there's fake news. That's telling us a version of what they want us to believe is happening right now. So you got a fictitious present and you got a real present. And you got 3 versions of the future. You get the idea that there's an inevitable future about which we can do nothing. And I don't believe in that. And then there is the probable future. What's likely to happen because we continue to do what we're doing. And then there's the possible future. What it could look like if we change what we're doing. So we got 2 pasts, 2 presents, and 3 futures. Now, the truth is, they all collapse right down to an infinite now. Everything is present in the block of marble. It only depends on the chiseler or the sculptor. What are you going to extract from the now? Are you going to extract a Charlie Brown figure, a Snoopy? You're going to extract a Pieta or a David? What are you choosing to extract from the data? But hidden in the data are all the possibilities that exist. So there is no future in that sense. And so in some senses, you can experience the effects of a future event right now, because there is only the now. There's only one block of marble. What are you going to do with it?
Trish?
Good morning, Seán. I read a lot of Edgar Cayce's information in the AR Institute, and one of the questions that I have for you, he talks a great deal about our habits, like our current habits, or whether they're OCDs or whatever, and then he relates that to how it could, or, you know, he's dead now, but how that could have been contributed or retributed to our past lives. And so my question for you is, what is your view on that? Whatever current habituations we have or OCDs or whatever, how much of that could be related to our past life?
It's a great question, and I agree totally with Edgar Cayce on this. He was an amazing prophet, the sleeping prophet, and it was fascinating. He was a man who was a Christian preacher by day, but when he went into trances, he became this medium who became a brilliant medical diagnostician and a huge believer in reincarnation and in karma. So it was fascinating what happened when he went into trance states. Now, as I said before, you know, everything that happens to a little infant in the first 2 years is hugely determining of the personality that emerges, you know, subsequently. But that little child has taken aboard all of the experiences of previous incarnations. And so the personality of any child is a multifactorial equation composed of all of the experiences in all of the lifetimes in which that child had, you know, previously lived, and true for every single one of us. So your personality right now, Trish, as Trish, you know, in 2020, is a composite of all of the roles you've played in all of the lifetimes of which you've been a part. And so just like in psychotherapy, often in order to try to determine, you know, the reason for a paranoia or an anxiety attack, or, you know, kind of any physical condition, we try to figure out, was it some event that happened? Were you traumatized? Did you witness an accident when you were 3 years of age? Or what happened in your childhood that could account for this neurotic, you know, behavior as an adult? And you try to go back and figure out what was the event that triggered this present reaction. Now, some of the present reactions are created by events that happened in past lifetimes, not just at earlier stages of this particular incarnation. And so there's a branch of psychology, of transpersonal psychology particularly, where you try to go back to the original event that triggered this particular kind of behavior. So let's say it's anxiety about, you know, being a healer, that somehow you have a healing ability, but you're afraid. So you don't want to be publicly seen by this. And it could well be that in past lifetimes, you were also a healer and you were burned at the stake as a witch. And so I said, I don't want that gift anymore, but you're not consciously aware of it anymore. But any ability, any opportunity to practice your healing gift, you're going to shy away from. Now, you can go back to the beginning of the birth in this lifetime and you won't find out the reason for it. But if you can go back through regressive therapy, you may find the initial event that orchestrated a cascade of subsequent kind of relationships. So very, very often OCD behavior, neurotic behavior of various kinds may have its origins, not just in an event earlier in this incarnation, but in a previous one. And so a very important form of therapy is trying to figure out what that was. What was the lifetime and what was the event that initiated this cascade of events that triggered this neurotic behavior in this particular lifetime. So I'm totally in agreement with Edgar Cayce on that.
Andrea?
I don't really have a question. I just wanted to say that I loved the synopsis and all of your sermons, and I like the model of subtraction. That really makes sense to me. The subtraction, you know, subtracting out the finite worlds, and there's just infinity. Because to me, there's only God. There's only love. Yes. Period. And so when you take out the negativity from your mind, you know, sometimes your mind goes into this judgmental, negative place. When you strip away all that negativity, there's only love, right? Yes. And it's the same thing with like false beliefs. You know, sometimes people think, well, it's impossible for me to meet blah, 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 whatever it is. And so that's just a false belief, right? It's not true. So once you strip away all those obstacles and false beliefs, then the magic happens. And so I just want to say, I just had so many visions when you were talking today, and it's just very exciting. And I think, yeah, I mean, what I'm working on in my life right now is just stripping away some of the judgment and the shame. So
Okay. That's a great point, Andrea. Thanks a million, Pat. So to kind of just respond to it anyway. The reason I know that love will win eventually, the reason I know is that, you know, there is only love. There is only God. That's actually a mantra that I repeat to myself again and again and again and again. There is only God. There is only love. There is only God. There is only love. So where does fear come from? Where does anger come from? Whatever. In a perverted sense, anger and fear are versions of love. And let me explain what I mean. They're actually versions of love.
I understand.
When a little baby is born, you know, it has to start life at the at one end of a spectrum. If the spectrum is service to self, all the ways to service to other on that spectrum, the baby has to begin at the service to self end of the spectrum. It, you know, has to be focused on breathing, on mother, on comfort, on cuddling, all these things. It's totally narcissistic, and it's an appropriate stage of narcissism. Now, the journey of life is to take us, you know, further and further along the path towards service to others. And when we cross the 51% line into service for others, then we become more and more enlightened beings. So we're moving along that spectrum. What happens is that because, you know, when the ego develops around the age of 8 months, the child comes to the terrible conclusion, oh my God, we're not just one entity. The mother-child complex with me in charge. I scream, mother appears. I'm hungry, milk appears. So the child is convinced for the first 8 months, obviously not consciously, but programmed in, I control the entire environment. There's just only me. And now at 8 months, the ego develops and the child begins to realize, holy God, there's two of us and all the power lies with her. She can withdraw affection. She can disappear. I'm stuck here. And that's when we start creating all of our defense mechanisms. So the defense mechanisms, fear, anxiety, whatever, they're actually predicated on self-love, on trying to protect and love the self. So every vice, every fear, every anxiety, every depression is actually a form of love, love trying to protect the vulnerability of the sense of separate self. And so that is why I know that ultimately love always wins out. So when you're faced then with the block of marble, and it seems like the marble, you know, only contains gunky stuff. It depends on what you choose to chisel away and what you choose to remain with. And so if I continue to focus on, you know, narcissism, service to self, what I'm going to encounter more and more, you know, negativity in my life. If all I can chisel away in a relationship is to be aware of the darkness or the difficulties of the other person, all I'm going to experience is that negativity. And so in order to dream a perfect dream, we have to understand that we're dreaming not from the ego, but from the soul. I've used this example before. There's a famous formula in physics that tells you the force of attraction between two heavenly bodies. So if you've got one heavenly, let's say Jupiter, you know, and planet Earth, two heavenly bodies, the force of attraction between them, F, is m1 multiplied by m2 divided by r squared, where m1 is the mass of Jupiter, m2 is the mass of the Earth, and r is the distance between the two of them. Now, you can increase the force of attraction in several ways. If you could increase the mass of any one of these planets, that would pull it faster. Or if you could shorten the gap between them, if they were closer to each other, then the gravitational attraction would be stronger. Now, most of us were dreaming about life from the ego, which is a tiny planet. And we're dreaming, you know, of a tiny little ideal. I want a bigger car, or I want a nicer house, or I want a better job. They're tiny little things. So two little marbles separated by 93 billion miles of space, you know, trying to attract each other, and the ego thinking, I'd like it, but I know I can't have it. So R is huge and the masses are tiny. So when you learn to dream from the soul is a gigantic planet. And you learn to dream a really great dream, not just for me, myself, personally, but for our planet, for our world, for our times. And you have faith. When Jesus says that if you have faith, even like a little mustard seed, and you say to this mountain, get up and throw yourself into the ocean, it will happen. So faith is shortening the distance between that which I'm praying for and that which I expect to happen. So hope and trust are, putting your hand in the hand of God, putting your hand in the hand of love, banishing, self-serving and thinking only of what God's will for our times and our planet is. And then all dreams come true.
Nancy.
First of all, Seán, thank you for the opportunity to talk about this topic. And I just wanted to go back to something you just recently said, that our current life has been affected by some part of our past life.
Yes.
And you mentioned OCD or, depression or neurotic behavior. And then I'm going to go back that you've often said that we signed up for this and that in our cohort, and you seem to find patterns in the family. You say, oh, yeah, this is my dad's reaction, or it's anger. It's mainly, it's not bad habits like alcoholism, but it's more, well, even mental illness, schizophrenia, you think, oh, it runs in the family. Just address that for a minute. Thank you.
Sure, that's a great question, Nancy. So when I say that we sign up for stuff, it's not that we're kind of, we're gluttons for punishment, or that we're masochists that enjoy suffering or pain. That's not the object of the exercise. The object of the exercise is to continue to learn lessons that bring us closer and closer and closer to the heart of God and to the heart of love. And so we tend to incarnate in what I've called preconception contracts, that a group of souls make a commitment to each other to come together lifetime after lifetime, even if it's in a different, culture, a different tribe, a different language, a different gender, it doesn't matter. These are small little details, but that we make a commitment to each other, that we will create a drama which will afford each member of the troop the opportunity to work on the specific issue that he or she wants to work on. And so we come into lifetime with people whom we've encountered before. And there are two kinds of people we bring into a lifetime. We're drawing from two different pods in between lives. The first one is what I would call the soul pod. There are people with whom we've had really loving relationships in past incarnations, people who make our heart sing. And the other one is what I call the shadow pod. We're going to bring people into every lifetime who are going to test us, who are going to be weeders in our lives. So I say that there are two kinds of people in my life. There are the fertilizers, the ones who love me unconditionally, and they're very good for my self-image. But if there were only fertilizers in my life, I'd become a total narcissist. So I bring into my life some weeders, people who point out my inadequacies. And even if they take great glee in pointing them out, and even if they exaggerate them wildly, if there's some truth to what they're saying, they are very, very important to my harvest. When I lived in Kenya and I worked with nomadic pastoralists who had no agricultural background, and I was trying to train them in basic agriculture, what we discovered really, really quickly is that if you had to make a choice between fertilizing the maize and weeding the maize in its early stages of germination, that for some reason you could only choose one or the other, it was much more important to do the weeding than to do the fertilizing, because fertilizer is blind. It gives growth to everything. The grass grows, the weeds grow, everything grows, and there's just a jungle there. If you weed and you don't fertilize, you get a good harvest. Not the best. It's good if you have some fertilizer. And so it becomes really, really important then that we look at all of the people in our lives. And again, I'm talking about this at every fractal level, all the ways from your soulmate to the world situation. There are people right throughout that entire spectrum who are part of your soul pod, and some of them are part of your shadow pod. And they're both vitally important because they're all helping you and our community, our nation, and our world to grow once we learn to chisel away that which is about anger, our fear, our judgment, our unforgiveness, and to uncover the gem, the David or the Christ figure within every situation.
Anna.
I was hoping that you could speak more to, you talk about this experience Jesus had as having a schizophrenic break and everyone in his world.
Yes.
Considering him mad
Yes.
And I was just hoping you could help me and us kind of reframe mental illness and so-called psychotic breaks in terms of mystical and shamanic experiences. How can we break out of the limiting language Western psychology has sort of imposed on these experiences?
That's a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant question, Hannah. And so there's a huge difference between spiritual emergency and spiritual emergence. And so what Western psychology and psychiatry particularly regards as a kind of a schizophrenic break in many different traditions, and you're au fait with the shamanistic tradition. In many cultures, this actually is evidence of a person's ability to kind of travel in altered states of consciousness. So there's a differentiation in transpersonal psychology between spiritual emergency on the one hand and spiritual emergence on the other hand. That in some senses, that what looks like a hallucinogenic, what looks like a schizophrenic break is actually an initiation rite into a different state of consciousness. Now, I believe, for instance, that even somebody in the middle of a schizophrenic encounter where they're hearing voices or seeing things, is that real or is it a hallucination? It is absolutely real. It means that this person has temporarily broken into a dimension in which, those images are present and those voices are present. Now, the difference is that it's like somebody who's bilingual as distinct from somebody who's monolingual. If I only speak English and I go to France and I insist on speaking English in France so that I can't be understood, shame on me. If I learn both languages, then I have to figure out it's appropriate when I'm in America to speak English, otherwise understood, and it's important when I'm in France to speak French, otherwise I won't be understood. And so what you hear in the mystical literature is that the difficulty with a kind of a schizophrenic break is that the schizophrenic drowns in the same waters in which the mystic swims. In other words, one person realizes that they're in a state of consciousness and they're privy to particular kinds of experiences which can't be shared in ordinary language with ordinary people who are stuck in a medical model that says this is, an illness. I have to be really, really careful with whom I share, those kinds of things. So I define imagination. I've said that imagination is not the faculty that allows us to make up stuff that's not real. That is not imagination. That's fantasy, which is very different. Imagination is the ability to volitionally shift my state of consciousness, enter into altered states where I encounter entities and energies that reside in those places, interact with them, learn from them, and then come back and bring that learning back into this place. But then I have to use the appropriate language to speak to people in this state of consciousness. And that's the function of, and you study this, this is the function of the shaman. The function of the shaman is through either, entheogens or through dancing or drumming or, piercing the body to enter into an altered state of consciousness where they're privy to those energies and those entities and that learning, and then bringing that back and cross-fertilizing it here. But they have to be really careful of their audience because some audiences are going to put them in a straitjacket and lock them up. And we have to realize that, it becomes really important that whatever state of consciousness I'm in, I have to be appropriate to the environment and to the people with whom I share that. And so, I'd be really careful that my behavior, if I've had, for instance, a deep spiritual mystical experience in an altered state of consciousness, when I want to try to import it into this reality, I have to be really, really careful that I'm not going to upset people so badly that they're going to want to lock me up, which is what the brothers and sisters of Jesus wanted to do with him. So we have to choose our words very carefully and choose the environment in which we choose to articulate or share the experiences we had. A huge example of this is up to the time of Raymond Moody's famous book, Life After Lives, where he talked about near-death experiences. Millions of human beings were having near-death experiences where they went through a tunnel, experienced the white light, had encounters with heavenly beings, did a life review, saw these extraordinary vistas, heard this extraordinary music, but they were afraid to talk about it because they would have been locked up. And so until his book broke, and subsequently there have been thousands of books written on this topic, it's reckoned at this stage that somewhere in the region of 15 million Americans have had near-death experiences because of resuscitation techniques in medicine right now. But most of them were afraid to share those. And when they did share them, they were regarded as being psychotic and sometimes locked up. So when you're privy to those kinds of experiences, you have to be really, really careful whom you choose to share it with and realize that there's behavior and there's languaging that's appropriate. Are you in France? Are you in England? Which language are you going to use right now? Brilliant question, Hannah.
Maria?
one thing you've spoken about in the past is about there's no space or time,
Yes.
either in the astral self or the ethereal self, and that has to do with the Atman portion of a being. And so you were saying there's no space, there's no time, but the most important one to me, it seems, would be when you said there's no causality. Can you just touch briefly on that? The causality, there's no causality in that
Sure.
area?
So just let me recap. It's a great question, Maria. Let me just recap for a moment. We know from relativity theory, E equals mc squared, that as something begins to approach the speed of light, time shrinks and space shrinks. So if we could reach the singularity where we're traveling at the speed of light, there would be no time. It would be zero time and zero space. So it would look like before the Big Bang happened. So we know actually from physics, that time and space are actually artifacts of allegedly the Big Bang. When you're dreaming at night, so I've reported a dream, for instance, where I'm back in 1956 in my childhood home in Mayfield in Cork City. I'm talking to my grandfather who died in December of 1956. So in an instant, as I'm dreaming, living up in Healdsburg where I do, in 2020, I've gone back 60 years and I've traveled 6,000 miles in an instant and I've recreated. So that has to do with the space and time. Now the causality piece of it. So in the physical world, we always think that if A happens, there must have been a previous cause. So something caused A to happen. And so we think of causation having a sequence, that the result always happens after the cause. As I've said a few minutes ago, in answer to a different question, that ain't necessarily true. And even modern science is beginning to figure out that sometimes the effect comes before the cause. So there's a reversal of the timepiece. But causation itself is the factor here. Now, causation, I believe, is the result of what I call the law of deferred outcome. As human beings, we have these really, really angry thoughts on a regular basis. So I'm driving down the freeway and somebody cuts me off. And I stick my hand out the window and I give them the figure. And I say, you so-and-so, I wish I'm going to kill you. Now, if I could translate that thought of anger, if it happened instantaneously, the freeways would be littered with dead bodies. There'd be automobile crashes every second on all the highways. So there's what I call the principle or the law of deferred outcome, that somehow the cosmos affords us a kind of a gap between what we think and the results of what we think. Often, our thoughts result. All great inventions are the result of thoughts. So we have a thought, we create a kind of a prototype, then we build a model. But every great invention started with a thought. And all thoughts have a consequence. But there's a time lag between them. On planet Earth, often there's a huge time lag between the thought we have and the result of the thought. In our dreams, that's not the case. When you're dreaming at night, as soon as you think of something, you create it. So the entire dream actually is fabricated by your thinking mind in the dream state. And there's no gap. You create the costumes, you create the location, you create the plot, you create the dialogue, you create all of the characters, and you play all of the roles, even though you identify just with the dream ego. So in the dream state, there is no causation in the sense that there is no gap between the thought and the outcome itself. Now, I think that in the states above the astral stage, at the soul level, results are immediately contiguous, with the thing that promoted it. And when you get to the stage of a person like a Jesus or an avatar figure, there's instantaneous, result of thought. So when Jesus stepped out of a boat, stepped onto the waves and walked across the water to the disciples, it was because he could translate into action, the thought of joining his companions. So we need to be protected because our minds are so filled with angry reactions, to life, that if our thoughts were translated immediately, there would be absolute mayhem. So causation is a kind of a safety valve built into incarnation to make sure that we're not slaughtering each other.
Wavin?
Is there an average number of lifetimes or incarnations most people come in for? And then does it really matter?
I know this is one which is very dear to your heart.
Thanks, because I'm counting them up.
So when you reach 10 to the power of 123, let me know, Wavin.
Thank you. Yeah.
Then you become a chess master. So I'm being facetious, obviously, but according to kind of experts in the field, like people like Edgar Cayce and others, the belief system is that we go through tens of thousands of incarnations, and that if you believe in sequential incarnations, that the time period between incarnations can be anywhere from instantaneous to 200 or 300 years. So there are cases, for instance, where I've done 2 exorcisms in my life. One was a young boy who was referred to me by another therapist there was all poltergeist activity happening in his home. There were spontaneous fires breaking out. There were pictures being moved off walls. There were loud sounds and stuff like that. And so I had a few sessions with himself and his parents, and I hypnotized him, and I regressed him, and I found out that he was in Florida with his parents, on vacation, and they were coming back to the airport, and they encountered a traffic accident in which a young man was killed. And the spirit of the young man, who was totally discombobulated, just thrown out of his spacesuit, and they stopped to see if they can help. And that other character took occupancy of this child's psyche. And so this child is carrying 2 psyches, his own and that of the discombobulated entity. And so over the course of 2 or 3 sessions, I was able to make contact with the entity, and point out, what the reality was, and that he needed to move towards the light. And then finally, after the 3rd session, he moved. And then finally, I went up to their home and offered mass at their home as the final part of it. So it can be anywhere from instantaneous to 200 or 300 years in between them. But that's if you regard incarnation as a chronological phenomenon. I personally believe that there may be parallel lifetimes in which you are simultaneously playing several roles, like Tom Hanks playing, in 3 different movie theaters, 3 different movies of his at the same time.
Teresa?
You mentioned your prayer study, which,
Right.
we were part of.
Yes.
So I remember your sort of the results of that as I understood it. And Bill often referenced to that. And I have a feeling we might be, you've expanded on that in a fuller way today, but my understanding was that you felt that those of us who were prayed for, there was not a change in what our outcome was, but the people who were deeply changed were the people who did the praying. So I've always felt their consciousness is what made such a difference. But Bill would say, "Oh, prayer doesn't matter," but there's a part of me that I felt, well, maybe Seán didn't have it all right.
Perish the thought.
Prayers do matter. And in fact, I loved it when we reconnected with you in saying that you were offering prayers for us and for Bill in particular. And now you're talking about prayer in the future, even if it hadn't happened yet. So maybe you would set me on a better course with what your feelings are about prayer.
Great. And so the one slight correction, Teresa, it's not accurate to say that the people being prayed for had no effect. They had a huge effect. The difference was that the people who were doing the praying, I call them agents. There were 90 agents.
Right.
And there were 417 people who were either in the control group or the experimental group. Everybody benefited very significantly in scientific terms, at p-values at 10 to the power of -6, which meant that there was only one chance, literally in a million, that the results could have happened randomly. Everybody benefited, but the most significant change was in the people doing the praying. So the people being prayed for benefited hugely. So it's not accurate to say they didn't benefit. They all benefited. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
So the question then becomes, do you change the world more by praying than you do being prayed for. Both of them change the world, but to really accelerate it, it's very important, you know, to move into the service to other from the service to self. So praying for others is very important. So what do I think about prayer? I think it is hugely impactful. So, but prayer is not where we're appealing to God to change an intended outcome. It is a laserized intentionality. So I believe there are 6 stages to really good prayer, Teresa. If I, as I'm doing today, I'm praying for the Burke family and for Captain Bell. The first thing I need to do, Seán, is to empty my heart of any darkness whatsoever towards anybody, anywhere. So I clean my heart out, because if I offer you a drink of water from a contaminated cup, you know, I'm not helping you. I have to make sure that the cup I'm offering you the water in is in pristine condition. So I have to make sure that the prayer is coming from an absolutely pristine, clean heart. For that, stage 1. Stage 2 is I have to fill up my heart with compassion. And compassion literally means that every one of us are just fingers on the same hand. We are not separate from each other. We're just different articulations of the same organism, our God. So that's stage 2. Stage 3 is I have to have a laserized intentionality. I can't say, oh, yeah, I remember the Burkes. Yeah, be nice. Let me pray for the Burkes today. Oh, look, I can see a rabbit out there. That's not prayer. It's a laserized intentionality where I have an image of Teresa Burke. I have an image of Andre. I have an image of Bill. I have an image of, you know, Derek. I have an image of Seán. I have an image of Colleen. You know, I have an image of Hannah in my mind. And I'm directing with laserized intentionality a prayer of compassion to them. The 4th piece is, you know, I then have to try and be supportive in a sociological fashion. Do I need to say and send these an email or a phone call or something? The 5th one is faith, belief system, trust, the realization that prayer really works. It's not changing God's mind. It's activating the God in me so that it encounters the God in you. And then 6thly is detachment. It's going to happen in God's way and in God's method. So I can't impose my timeline and my methodology on the outcome. So these are the 6 stages. And I guarantee you with that kind of a model, prayer is hugely effective. It's the most important changer of human outcomes of anything I know.
I think a few weeks ago when we first started connecting on Zoom, I think I felt troubled by something that I felt was being expressed. And you know, because we've been out of tune with you for a number of years on this, that maybe I'm misunderstanding. But you talk about avatars, and I feel I'm getting the sense that you're talking about Jesus Christ as being an avatar. And anyway, that I believe that would be so, but to me, he's so much more. He's the Son of God. He's not just a great avatar that has come into our world like Buddha, like Muhammad, like Gandhi, who are incredible people who have brought, you know, great ideas, great belief systems, great way of life, changing things. But Jesus is God, and he's, I cannot accept the idea that he's an avatar like these others. And am I missing something in the terminology of what you're expressing?
No, you're not. Because I believe, Teresa, that you're God as much as Jesus was God. The difference is he totally self-realized that he was a fractal of source, and the rest of us are distributed along a line of unknowingness or unawareness. And so when Jesus says very famously in his final homily at the Last Supper, he says, I want you to be in me as I am in the Father. The same things I do, you will do, and even greater. And so what Jesus is saying, Jesus is coming as an exemplar of somebody who's fully awakened. So being an avatar or being enlightened is not a toggle switch that you're either on or off. It's a slider. I don't know, in your home, what kinds of switches you have, but some parts of my house, I can decide the degree of luminosity in a room by just moving the slider upwards or downwards. Jesus is a slider that's moved completely into identification with his divinity. We are sliders that are barely moved. So we think that we're children of God, that we're separated from God, that sin separates us from God, that hell separates us from God, that we're separate from each other, that we're separate from nature, and nothing can be further from the truth. We are fractals of source. There is only God. We are characters in God's dream. I like to say sometimes, we are God in drag. We are the ways in which God experiences incarnation. The difference among us is that there are some life forms which are much more self-conscious. Like, for instance, presumably a human being is more self-aware than a frog is. But among human beings, there are degrees of self-awareness. And Jesus is a human being, an incarnation of the divine, like Teresa Burke is, who's fully awake to the reality that he is God. Teresa Burke and Seán ÓLaoire and other people think, if we're lucky, maybe Jesus will smile on us and our Mary will drag us in through the back door and save us from hell. The truth is, when you wake up to who you really are, you're a bite-sized piece of God. And this was the message of Jesus. Jesus was not pointing to Jesus, the carpenter from Nazareth. He was pointing to the awakened soul that was representative of the only thing that really exists, which is God herself. So you didn't mishear me. Namaste, guys.